The American Revolution is one of the most interesting periods, I think, for for Americans to study. Right, as children, we learn about the um, the revolution and the sort of great promises of freedom and independence that it gives, and that's certainly true, I think, for a lot of people. However, it's important for us to realize, and I think one of us say often gets derisively cited as revisionist history, but it's important for us to remember that when we look at history, the history of the revolution, right, those promises that are discussed in the Declaration of Independence or those ideas in the Constitution, which we'll discuss in a little bit, don't sort of fall upon everybody equally, right? They are things that sort of fall onto different groups at different times, and those promises are unrealized by a lot of people then, and even still today, 250 some odd years later. So one of the big questions, even at the time of the revolution, was how revolutionary was the American Revolution? Well, it's important for us to be aware, right? When the American Revolution is going on, it was not the case that people sort of understood the revolution to be the sort of upending or the total eradication of the years, the generations, the decades before it. There was no change really for a lot of people. So there's a lot of democracy that already existed throughout the colonies, right? Whether that's in Pennsylvania and New Jersey that had quite extensive democracy, or places like Virginia that had more limited democracy, but a democracy nonetheless. When we look at sort of, so, and again, in comparison to a place like the French Revolution, where at least in the middle of the French Revolution, there were massive changes, right? The Catholic Church had been eradicated as an institution in France. Nobility had been sacrificed. So, unlike that here in the United States, or what becomes the United States, that is not the case, right? I mean, there is no aristocracy, and this maybe is jumping a point, but there's no aristocracy in the United States pre-revolution, and there's none after the revolution, right? The revolution does not change that. And in fact, it entrenches sort of who those aristocrats may be, right? Those wealthy landlords are are given more power. Along with that, right, is the idea that in the United States or in the colonies pre-revolution, no one is either too rich or too poor. Everybody is kind of in the middle. No one is a pauper. No one is living too poor to even survive. And others, no one is too rich. There is no nobility. There is no one who is at the top end of the ladder. So in terms of this, right, that revolution doesn't change. The American Revolution doesn't change too much. And, the analogy that is used is, the lid on the box changes, but the contents are still the same. So when we look at the revolution, right, it's important to realize that we call it a revolution because it gets rid of the government, it gets rid of the king, it gets rid of the governors, but it doesn't change too much in real life. Now, that being said, there is a lot that goes on within, right? And R.R. Palmer talks about this, right? Where we are looking at the revolutions of the American Revolution in the 1770s and into the 80s. There's a lot of emigres that leave the United States for places, people who are loyalists to the crown of Britain, and they leave, right? They go back to England, they go to Canada, they go to the Caribbean, to places that the British government controls. And that happens in every revolution, right? In the French Revolution, nobles flee, their territory and go back to nobles in France flee to Switzerland or the German provinces or England or wherever, Britain. And that's true here. The American Revolution, though, is important for a couple of things, right? Why is it important? And R. Palmer says it's one of the most important revolutions in the 18th century, only sort of second to the French Revolution. And why is that? The reason is this. One, the economic troubles that are created out of the American Revolution fundamentally changed the game for the Europe, right? One of the financial troubles that the French will be in come out of the American Revolution and the assistance that they give us. The other thing that happens here is when you have the principle of a revolution that can change the government, has a major impact on the world, right? This sort of underclass group of people who have their rights of being infringed upon, and whatever those rights may be, and then breaking away from a government because of it, that is a huge thing. So let's talk a little bit about what that means, right? When the colonies go through, when the British government is going through financial trouble because of warfare, because of the 7 Years' War, and so on, they're putting taxes on the colonies. Now, for the English, right, for the British, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who is the leader of the British Treasury at the time, he says that because the American colonies are colonies nonetheless, they must pay to defending themselves, and it is part of sort of being in the empire. But for the colonial viewpoint, right, their view is we are British citizens. We must have representation in the government, and you did not present. You cannot you cannot put tax on us without us consenting to it. And then again, going back to this, right, the English or the British viewpoint here is colonial citizens are not British citizens. They are colonials, right? And the rights that are given to British citizens do not extend to those people living on the other side of the Atlantic. And that's really where the sort of significance of the American Revolution comes in, right? This idea that rights fall equally. And again, we know that it's not terribly equally. Well, okay, so then there are taxes put on, and the Stamp Act is one of them in 1765, one of the most repugnant of these taxes, because it really just sort of falls across, it really sort of hits everybody. But one of the people that are really most involved in this, right, when you look at it affecting legal documents, marriage certificates, newspapers, playing cards, this is the upper class folk who are going to be impacted on this, right? Lawyers who have to submit legal documents are going to have to pay for this stamp. So again, all of these things are falling into these troubles, right? Now, it's important for us to realize that a majority of the people in the United States or in the colonies at this point are rebels. They are the ones who are fighting against the British Crown. The vast majority are rebels or falling into that sort of neutral but support the patriot rebel cause, and the very vast minority are loyalists, people who support the crown, the English, the British. Why? Well, because there was this understanding that we as British colonials should receive the same benefits that our brothers and sisters in Britain are receiving. And there are some people, right, whose economic situations make them loyalists, right? The Palmer uses William Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's oldest son, who becomes a governor in New Jersey, as an example, right? He saw his benefit tied to the British crown, so he doesn't break away like his father does. Where, also you have Thomas Hutchison, who is the governor in Massachusetts, right? Also, again, seeing his star attached to the British and remains loyal, and both wind up going back to Britain. That's why when in 1776, there is the pamphlet Common Sense, which comes out in January of 1776, really helps solidify the cause for revolution. People see this document, and they sort of, hear Paine discussing the vast distance between Britain and the United States or America, and the ending of the need for British control. This is sort of where the idea of salutary neglect comes in. I don't really like that term, right? So the term salutary neglect refers to this idea that the British government and the British Empire neglected, there was a welcome neglect that occurred by the British of the American colonies, as long as they continued to pay their taxes and supply the goods, they would continue to be neglected. I don't like that term because I don't know that there was actually salutary neglect, right? I don't know that. But anyway, so the sort of idea of salutary neglect is that then, because of this lack of British control, what then happens is lack of British control, American institutions could continue to grow, and they did not need Britain any longer. So the Declaration of Independence was accepted, and do we know that in July of 1776, America declares its independence from Britain. Now, when we fast forward to the end of the war, right, and we look at the creation of a constitution, right, constitutions are documents that create a government. And the importance of the American Constitution is a couple of things, right? Number one is most countries, most governments in the 1780s, when the American Constitution is being created, did not have a constitution, right? The king or the leader was the constituted power. So to have a document that lays out the government's role was really significant at the time. Most places didn't have that. Now, Britain did have a constitution. Britain's constitution was is still today an unwritten constitution, right? It's a set of documents and a set of ideas that exist in Britain, but there's not one document you can point to like there is here in the United States. The other piece to this that is important is that it is a document that, at least in theory, represents the whole people of the United States. It says that we as a governing body are created to protect the rights of and develop this sort of country as it is. Now, again, all these things, whether or not they actually happen, again, are significant. So the Constitution, right, protects private property. It protects the value of the individual's possessions. It establishes a strong central government, but it also limits the authority of that government. Again, none of that existed throughout the world in this period. It also creates a republic. There are small republics at the time, in Europe, the Republic of Venice and so on, but there's not many republics globally. So the United States being one was significant at the time. So the American Revolution certainly was a revolution. It changes who is at the top of the government. It does not change sort of the rights and the privileges of the people too much or too drastically, but its importance is sort of an ideological one. It changes the role of the individual, and it changes how the government interacts with those people. One of the biggest changes, and this is sort of where my research comes in, one of the biggest changes that occurs here in the 1780s and 90s is the idea of education. People now need to be educated to be citizens. They need to be educated in how to read and write and interact with the people of with apparati of the government. And that is important to know, right? There is a change in how a person was to be educated, to be formed, to be a member of society. And that's why the American Revolution, I think, is the most important.